The old community center on Maple Street had seen better days. Its wooden floors creaked with every step, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting uneven shadows across the large main hall. But none of that mattered to the people who gathered there every Friday evening. To them, this place was home away from home, a space where neighbors became family and strangers became friends. It was 6:30 in the evening when people started arriving for the monthly potluck dinner. The tradition had been going on for nearly 15 years, started by a group of residents who believed that in a world growing increasingly disconnected, their little neighborhood could be different. They could actually know each other's names, share meals, and be there for one another. A woman in her mid-40s pushed through the heavy front door, carefully balancing a glass dish in her hands. She wore a simple blue cardigan over a white blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Nothing about her appearance drew attention. She was the kind of person you might pass in the grocery store aisle without a second glance. In fact, that's exactly where most people in the neighborhood did see her, scanning items at the checkout counter with the same gentle efficiency she brought to everything in her life. The aroma of her homemade apple pie wafted through the room as she made her way to the long table set up along the far wall. Already the table was filling up with an impressive array of dishes. There was Mrs. Patterson's famous lasagna, still steaming in its foil-covered pan. Next to it sat 3 different varieties of salad, a massive pot of chili, fresh bread rolls, and enough desserts to feed twice the number of people expected. "Oh, you brought the apple pie again?" Mrs. Patterson said with genuine delight, making room on the crowded table. "My husband has been talking about it since last month. I swear he comes to these dinners just for your pie." The woman smiled softly, setting down her dish with care. "It's the only thing I know how to make really well," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the growing noise of the gathering crowd. "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson replied. "But I'm glad you stick with it. If it's not broken, don't fix it, right?" The woman nodded and stepped back from the table, letting others add their contributions. She found her usual spot near the wall, where she could observe the room without being in the center of attention. This was her comfort zone, the invisible space between fully participating and completely withdrawing. The room continued to fill. Young families arrived with children who immediately broke free from their parents' hands and ran toward the corner where toys were kept in old cardboard boxes. Elderly couples came in slowly, greeted warmly by everyone they passed. Single professionals stopped by after work, still in their business clothes, grateful for a home-cooked meal and friendly faces. The neighborhood was a genuine mix of people from different backgrounds, different ages, different stories. By 7 o'clock, nearly 60 people packed the community center. The noise level had risen to a comfortable roar of overlapping conversations and children's laughter. Someone had turned on the sound system, and soft background music played, though it was barely audible over the crowd. In the far corner of the room, almost forgotten by most, sat an old upright piano. It had been donated to the community center about 8 years ago by someone who was moving and couldn't take it with them. At first, a few people had played it during gatherings. There had even been talk of starting piano lessons for the neighborhood kids, but time had not been kind to the instrument. The piano's dark wood finish had dulled and scratched from years of abuse. People stacked coats on top of it. Someone had once set a wet glass on its surface, leaving a permanent ring. The keys had yellowed like old teeth, and several of them stuck when pressed. Worse still, at least 5 or 6 notes simply didn't work anymore, producing nothing but a dull thunk when played. The piano had transformed from a musical instrument into expensive furniture, a table that happened to have keys. Nobody paid it any attention anymore. It was just part of the background, like the old basketball hoop hanging on the wall or the faded motivational posters that nobody actually read. Dinner began in the usual chaotic but cheerful way. People lined up with paper plates, loading them with generous portions of food. The children, of course, went straight for the desserts and had to be redirected by their parents to try some vegetables first. Friends sat together in clusters of folding chairs, balancing plates on their laps and sharing stories about their week. The woman with the apple pie sat with a small group of quieter residents. She listened as they talked about their jobs, their families, their small triumphs and frustrations. She nodded at the right moments, smiled when appropriate, and occasionally added a brief comment, but mostly she listened. She had become very good at listening over the years. As the meal wound down and people finished their food, the energy in the room shifted. This was the social portion of the evening, when people moved around more freely, when new conversations started, when the children got louder, and the adults more relaxed. Some people began cleaning up, carrying dishes to the small kitchen at the back. Others gathered in tight circles, laughing loudly at jokes and stories. A man in an expensive-looking suit, his tie loosened after a long workday, stood near the center of the room holding court with a group of neighbors. He was a local real estate agent, successful and well-known in the community. His laugh was the loudest in the room, his gestures the most animated. He was the type of person who filled whatever space he occupied, who seemed to believe that life was meant to be lived at full volume. He was also known for his jokes and pranks. Nothing mean-spirited, he would insist, just good fun to keep things interesting. He'd once convinced a new neighbor that the community center was built on an ancient burial ground. Another time, he'd organized a fake award ceremony for the worst cook in the neighborhood, complete with a homemade trophy. People laughed, though some privately wondered if his sense of humor sometimes crossed lines. As conversations began to lull, and people looked around for what might happen next, the real estate agent scanned the room with the eye of someone looking for entertainment. The evening couldn't just end with dinner. There needed to be something more, something memorable. His eyes moved across the familiar faces, landing briefly on the woman in the blue cardigan who sat quietly in her usual spot. Then his gaze shifted to the old piano in the corner, currently buried under a pile of coats and purses. A smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that meant he'd just had an idea, the kind of smile that, if you knew him well enough, meant someone was about to become the center of attention whether they wanted to be or not. He rubbed his hands together and raised his voice to address the entire room. The moment that would change everything was about to begin, though nobody in that community center, least of all the quiet woman in the blue cardigan, could have possibly known it yet. The broken piano was about to sing again. The real estate agent clapped his hands together loudly, the sound cutting through the ambient noise of the community center like a knife. Conversations paused. Heads turned. He had that effect on people, commanding attention without really trying, or perhaps trying so naturally that it seemed effortless. All right, everyone, he called out, his voice booming across the room. We can't just eat and talk all night. We need some entertainment, some culture, some class. A few people chuckled, knowing his tone. This was how he always started something. A joke was coming, or a story, or some scheme to make the evening more interesting. Most people welcomed it. The potluck dinners could sometimes drag on without much happening. Just the same conversations repeating month after month. The agent walked toward the piano in the corner, and several people followed his movement with curious eyes. He started pulling coats and purses off the top of it, tossing them onto nearby chairs without much care. We have this beautiful instrument just sitting here, gathering dust in designer handbags, he announced, running his hand across the top of the piano, leaving a trail in the thin layer of dust. What kind of community are we if we don't appreciate the finer things in life? We need music. Live music. Mrs. Patterson laughed from across the room. That piano hasn't worked properly in years, Tom, and nobody here plays anyway. Tom. Yes, that was the agent's name. Tom Reynolds. He'd sold houses to at least a third of the people in this room. Doesn't work? Tom pressed a few keys dramatically. Some of them produced sound, others just clicked uselessly. Listen to that. That's character. That's authenticity. That's vintage charm. He grinned widely, pleased with his own joke. And as for nobody playing, I refuse to believe that. We've got, 60 people here? Somebody has to play piano. His eyes scanned the room deliberately, moving from face to face. People avoided his gaze, some laughing nervously, others suddenly finding their phones very interesting. Nobody wanted to be volunteered for whatever Tom was planning. Then his eyes landed on the woman in the blue cardigan. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. She'd been hoping to become invisible, to blend into the wall behind her. It was a skill she'd developed over the years. But tonight invisibility failed her. You, Tom said, pointing directly at her. I bet you play piano. She shook her head quickly, her eyes widening slightly. No, I don't think that's a good idea. Come on, Tom pressed, walking toward her now. The crowd was watching. some smiling, others looking uncomfortable. You've got that look about you. Quiet people always have hidden talents. It's a scientific fact. I read it somewhere. I really don't think, she started. But Tom was already gesturing to the piano bench. Just one song, he said, his voice taking on that cajoling tone that he probably used to close real estate deals. What's the worst that could happen? The piano's already broken. You can't make it worse. A few people in the crowd laughed. Others started clapping, encouraging her. Come on, give it a try, someone called out. It'll be fun, another voice added. She felt her cheeks growing warm. Her heart started beating faster. This was exactly the kind of attention she'd spent years avoiding. Being seen, being noticed, being put on the spot in front of dozens of people. Tom, leave her alone if she doesn't want to, Mrs. Patterson said. But her voice was gentle, not forceful. She wasn't really defending the woman so much as making a token gesture. I'm not forcing anyone, Tom said, raising his hands in mock surrender. I'm just saying we've got a piano, we've got time, and I have a feeling that our friend here has been holding out on us. Haven't you? The woman looked around the room. All eyes were on her now. Children had stopped playing to watch. Conversations had completely died down. The moment had taken on a weight that seemed disproportionate to what was actually happening. It was just a broken piano. It was just a Friday evening. It was just a group of neighbors being silly. But to her, it was so much more than that. It was a door she'd closed and locked 7 years ago. It was a part of her life she'd buried so deep that she'd almost convinced herself it had never existed at all. I haven't played in a very long time, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Perfect, Tom said, either not hearing her reluctance or choosing to ignore it. That means you're due for a comeback. Come on, everyone wants to hear it. Right, everyone? The crowd responded with more applause and encouragement. Most of them thought it was harmless fun. They thought they were being supportive. They didn't know they were asking her to open a wound that had never properly healed. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Part of her wanted to just leave, to grab her empty pie dish and walk out the door and never come back to these Friday gatherings. But another part of her, a part she'd tried to silence for 7 years, was stirring awake. That part whispered that maybe this was meant to happen, maybe this ridiculous moment, engineered by a thoughtless real estate agent looking for entertainment, was exactly what she needed. The walk to the piano felt like it took forever, though it couldn't have been more than 15 steps. Every eye in the room followed her movement. Some people were smiling encouragingly. Others looked curious about what would happen. A few seemed uncomfortable, sensing that this might not be the light-hearted joke Tom intended it to be. She reached the piano bench and stood there for a moment, staring down at the yellowed keys. Someone had spilled something on a few of them. The wood of the bench was scratched and worn. This piano had been neglected, abandoned, treated as nothing more than furniture. She understood that feeling. Tom stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching with an expectant grin. He was already imagining how this would play out. Either she'd plunk out a terrible version of Chopsticks and everyone would laugh, or she'd refuse and sit down and he'd let her off the hook after milking the moment a bit longer. Either way, he'd gotten his entertainment, his moment of being the center of attention by putting someone else there. The room had gone almost completely silent now. Even the young children sensed that something important was happening, though they couldn't have explained what or why. The woman sat down on the bench. It creaked under her weight, the old wood protesting. She placed her purse on the floor beside her. Then she lifted her hands and held them above the keyboard, her fingers trembling slightly. For a long moment she didn't move. She just stared at the keys, her hands hovering in the air like she was afraid to actually touch them. Her breathing had become shallow. Her eyes glistened, though she blinked rapidly to clear them. Tom shifted his weight, starting to sense that maybe this wasn't going the way he'd planned. The silence was stretching too long. It was becoming awkward rather than anticipatory. You don't have to if you don't want to, he said, his voice quieter now, less performative. But she didn't respond to him. She wasn't hearing him anymore. She wasn't hearing anything except a voice in her memory. A young voice, bright and full of life, saying the same thing that voice had said hundreds of times before. Just feel the music, Mom. Don't think about it. Just feel it. Her hands lowered slowly until her fingers rested on the keys. The piano was cold beneath her touch, the ivory smooth and foreign after so many years away. She pressed down gently on middle C, testing it. The note sounded weak and slightly out of tune, but it sounded. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and then she began to play. The first notes that came from the piano were hesitant, almost apologetic. Her fingers moved slowly across the keys, testing each one like she was greeting old friends she wasn't sure would remember her. Some keys responded. Others stuck or produced no sound at all. But she didn't stop. Around the room, people exchanged glances. A few smirked, thinking this was going exactly as expected. An awkward performance on a broken instrument by someone who clearly didn't want to be there. Tom had gotten his entertainment after all, though perhaps not in the way he'd hoped. Someone in the back coughed. A child whispered something to their mother and was quietly shushed. The atmosphere in the community center had shifted from anticipatory to uncomfortable. People didn't know where to look. Should they watch her? Should they pretend to be busy with something else to save her embarrassment? But the woman at the piano bench seemed unaware of any of this. Her eyes remained closed. Her head tilted slightly to one side, the way someone might tilt their head when trying to hear a distant sound. Her fingers continued their exploration of the keyboard, moving from the lower notes to the higher ones, mapping out which keys worked and which didn't. Mrs. Patterson leaned over to her husband and whispered, "Should someone stop this? Poor thing looks like she's about to cry." Her husband shrugged helplessly. "What are we supposed to do? She'll stop when she's ready." But the woman didn't stop. Instead, something began to change. Her posture, which had been stiff and uncertain when she first sat down, started to relax. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing deepened and steadied. The tension that had been visible in every line of her body began to melt away. And then her fingers found a pattern. It started simply. A basic chord progression in the key of C major. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would impress a trained musician. But there was something about the way she played it. Something about the touch of her fingers on those old keys that made people pause their whispered conversations. The melody emerged slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark landscape. It was a classical piece, though most people in the room wouldn't have been able to name it. The kind of music you'd hear in a movie during an emotional scene, or in a fancy hotel lobby, or at a recital where parents sat proudly watching their children perform. Her right hand carried the melody while her left hand provided the foundation, the bass notes that gave the piece its depth and structure. But here's where something remarkable started to happen. The broken keys, the ones that didn't work, should have ruined the performance. They should have created gaps in the music, awkward silences where notes were supposed to be. Instead, she played around them. When her fingers would have hit a dead key, they shifted slightly, finding a different note that still fit the harmony. When a key stuck and couldn't be played quickly, she adjusted the timing, turning what should have been a flaw into a deliberate pause. It was like watching someone navigate a familiar path in the dark, knowing instinctively where each obstacle lay. The smirks around the room began to fade. People stopped their side conversations. Someone who had been checking their phone lowered it slowly, drawn in by the sound. This wasn't the amateur plunking they'd expected. This was something else entirely. Tom, who had started this whole thing, stood with his arms now hanging loosely at his sides, his confident grin replaced by an expression of genuine surprise. This was not part of the script he'd written in his head. This was not how the joke was supposed to end. The piece grew more complex. Her fingers moved faster now, more confidently. The muscle memory was coming back, awakening after years of forced sleep. Her hands knew this music in a way that went deeper than conscious thought. They knew it in their bones, in their tendons, in the thousands of hours spent practicing these same movements. A teenage girl near the front row nudged her friend and whispered, "Oh my God, she's actually really good." Her friend nodded, eyes wide, like really, really good. The children who moments ago had been fidgeting and restless now sat quietly on the floor, mesmerized by the sound. There's something about live music, especially unexpected live music, that captures attention in a way that recorded music never quite can. You can see the effort, witness the creation happening in real time. It becomes more than just sound. It becomes an event. An elderly man near the refreshment table felt his eyes beginning to water. The music had triggered something in him, some memory from long ago. His wife noticed and took his hand, squeezing it gently. She understood. Music has that power. It can reach into the past and pull moments forward, make you feel things you thought you'd forgotten how to feel. The woman's face had transformed completely. The fear and reluctance that had defined her expression when Tom first called her out were gone. In their place was something that looked almost like peace, but more active than that. It was concentration, certainly, but it was also release. Like she'd been holding her breath for 7 years and was finally allowed to exhale. Her fingers danced across the keys now with increasing confidence. The hesitation had burned away completely. She leaned into the music, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. When she reached a section where 3 keys in a row didn't work, she improvised, her right hand jumping an octave higher to complete the phrase. Instead of breaking the flow, it actually added something unexpected and beautiful to the piece. Someone in the crowd actually gasped at that moment. It was Mrs. Chen, who had taken piano lessons as a child and knew enough to recognize not just skill, but artistry. What this woman was doing wasn't just playing notes on a page. She was interpreting, feeling, creating. The piece built toward what felt like a climax. The tempo increased. Both hands worked in intricate patterns, weaving together in a way that seemed impossible on such a damaged instrument. The piano itself, neglected and forgotten for so long, seemed to respond to her touch. Yes, it was out of tune. Yes, many keys didn't work. But what remained was enough. In her hands, it was more than enough. And then, just as the music reached its highest point of intensity, she pulled back. The volume dropped. The tempo slowed. Her fingers moved from the middle of the keyboard down to the lower register, where the notes were deeper, more resonant, more melancholy. This was the heart of the piece, you could tell. This was what everything had been building toward. Not the flashy fast parts, but this moment of quiet intensity. The melody became simpler, but somehow more profound. Each note seemed to carry weight, to mean something beyond just its place in the composition. Tears were now streaming openly down her face, but her hands never faltered. If anything, they played with even greater certainty. This was why she hadn't played in 7 years. This was what she'd been avoiding. Not the music itself, but what the music made her feel. What it made her remember. A mother near the back row held her young daughter closer, not entirely understanding why she felt the sudden need to do so. The little girl looked up at her mother with questioning eyes. But the mother just smiled and stroked her hair, grateful beyond words for her presence. The music continued to wind down, growing softer and slower, like a music box running out of spring tension. The melody became sparse, just a few carefully chosen notes, each one given space to breathe and resonate before the next one came. And then, finally it ended. Her hands lifted from the keys and came to rest in her lap. She kept her eyes closed for several seconds longer, as if unwilling to return to the present moment, to the community center, to the 60 people who had just witnessed something they hadn't been prepared for. The silence that followed was absolute. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. In that stretched moment, nobody in the community center seemed to know quite what to do. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that didn't fit into the usual framework of their Friday evening gatherings. This wasn't supposed to happen. Tom's joke had somehow transformed into something real, something profound. Then someone started clapping. It was the elderly man whose eyes had watered during the performance. His applause was slow at first, deliberate, the kind of clapping that says, "I understand what I just heard." His wife joined him immediately, and then it spread like wildfire through the room. The applause wasn't polite. It wasn't the kind of clapping you do because everyone else is doing it. It was genuine, enthusiastic, almost thunderous in its intensity. People stood up from their folding chairs. The teenagers who usually couldn't be bothered to care about anything stopped looking at their phones and clapped with real energy. Even the small children, who didn't fully understand what had happened, clapped along with the infectious enthusiasm that kids have when they see adults excited about something. "Wow," someone shouted over the noise. "Just wow." The woman at the piano bench finally opened her eyes. She looked startled, almost confused, as if she'd forgotten there were other people in the room. Her cheeks were still wet with tears, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the emotion she'd displayed so openly. She turned slightly on the bench to face the crowd, and the applause somehow grew even louder. People were whistling now. A few were calling out things like, "That was amazing," and "Where have you been hiding?" Tom stood frozen in place, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He looked like someone who'd casually tossed a stone into a pond expecting a small splash, and instead triggered a tidal wave. He began clapping too, but mechanically, his mind clearly somewhere else. This wasn't how his evening was supposed to go. He'd wanted a laugh, a moment of light entertainment. He'd gotten something much bigger and more complicated than that. Mrs. Patterson made her way through the crowd toward the piano, moving as quickly as her 72-year-old legs would carry her. She reached the woman and immediately pulled her into a hug, not saying anything, just holding her. The gesture said everything that needed to be said. When Mrs. Patterson finally pulled back, she kept her hands on the woman's shoulders and looked her directly in the eyes. "My dear girl, that was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard in my life. Where on earth did you learn to play like that?" The woman opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, other people crowded around. Everyone wanted to say something, to ask something, to be part of whatever this moment was. "That was incredible," a young mother said, bouncing her toddler on her hip. "I got actual chills." "You need to teach my daughter," another parent said eagerly. "She's been begging for piano lessons, but all the teachers around here are so expensive or have waiting lists." "How long have you been playing?" someone asked. "What was that piece?" "I need to find it on Spotify." "The way you worked around the broken keys, that was genius. Like actual genius." The questions came faster than she could possibly answer them. She felt overwhelmed. Her brief moment of peace at the piano replaced by a different kind of intensity. All these people, all these voices, all these expectations suddenly being placed on her shoulders. "Give her some space, everyone," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice firm but kind. "Let the woman breathe." The crowd pulled back slightly, but the energy in the room remained electric. People were talking excitedly to each other now, processing what they'd just witnessed. Friends were pulling out their phones, texting other neighbors who hadn't made it to the potluck. "You missed something amazing," they typed. "You won't believe what just happened." The teenage girl who'd commented earlier during the performance worked up the courage to approach. She stood nervously a few feet away until the woman noticed her and gave a small smile. "Yes, sweetie?" the woman asked, her voice still shaky. "I just wanted to say," the girl began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I've been learning piano for 3 years, and my teacher keeps telling me I need to feel the music, not just play the notes. I never really understood what that meant until just now. Watching you, I got it. Thank you." The woman's eyes filled with tears again. She reached out and squeezed the girl's hand. "Keep playing," she said softly. "Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The girl nodded and backed away, clearly moved by the interaction. Tom finally found his voice and his legs. He approached the piano looking sheepish in a way that people who knew him would have said was completely out of character. Tom Reynolds didn't do sheepish, but here he was, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. "Listen, I need to apologize," he said, speaking directly to the woman but loud enough that others nearby could hear. "I was just messing around. I didn't know you could actually play. I certainly didn't know it would be like that. If I'd known it was going to upset you, I never would have pushed. I'm really sorry." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Tom braced himself, expecting anger or at least coldness. He deserved it. He'd made her the butt of his joke, put her on the spot in front of everyone, but instead she smiled. It was a small smile, sad around the edges, but genuine. "Don't apologize," she said. "Maybe I needed someone to push me. Maybe I needed to be forced back to the piano, even if it was through a joke." Tom didn't look entirely convinced that he was off the hook, but he nodded, grateful for her grace. Mrs. Chen, the woman who had gasped during the performance, approached next. Unlike the others who'd been asking questions or offering praise, she had a more thoughtful expression on her face. "I don't want to pry," Mrs. Chen said gently, "but I know a little bit about music. I taught piano for 15 years before I retired. And what I heard tonight wasn't just someone who learned to play. That was someone who lived music, who breathed it. But there was also something else in how you played. Pain, maybe, or loss." The woman from the piano bench stiffened slightly, her smile fading. Mrs. Chen continued, her voice even softer now. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. But I just want you to know, whatever brought you back to that piano tonight, I'm glad it did. Music like that doesn't come from technique alone. It comes from the soul. And yours has been through something, hasn't it?" The room had quieted again. People sensed that something important was being said, even if they couldn't hear the exact words. The woman looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly from the performance. These hands that had once done this every day, these hands that had taught someone else to do the same. These hands that had avoided piano keys for 7 long years because touching them was too painful, too full of memory. "I haven't played since my daughter died," she said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Chen's hand went to her mouth. Mrs. Patterson, still standing nearby, made a small sound of understanding and sorrow. Tom's face went pale. Around them, the people close enough to hear stopped their conversations mid-sentence. "She was the musician in our family," the woman continued, her voice steady now, as if speaking the truth out loud was easier than she'd expected. "From the time she was 5 years old, she lived for music. Piano was her first love, but she played other instruments too. Guitar, violin, even taught herself some drums. She had this gift. This natural, effortless gift that I'd never had even though I was her teacher." Someone in the crowd was crying now, though trying to do it quietly. "I taught her everything I knew," the woman went on. "But by the time she was 12, she'd surpassed me. By 15, she was playing pieces I could never master. She talked about going to music school, becoming a concert pianist, or maybe a composer. She had so many dreams." Mrs. Chen reached out and took the woman's hand, holding it firmly. "She was 17 when the accident happened. 7 years ago this month, actually. A drunk driver ran a red light. She died instantly. At least that's what they told me. I hope it's true. I hope she didn't suffer." The community center, moments ago so full of excitement and questions, had become a place of collective grief. Strangers felt tears on their cheeks for a girl they'd never known, for a tragedy they'd never heard about until this moment. "I couldn't touch a piano after that," the woman said. "Couldn't listen to music. Couldn't even walk past music stores without feeling like someone was reaching into my chest and squeezing my heart. Every note reminded me of her. Every melody was another thing she'd never get to play, never get to hear." She looked up, making eye contact with the people around her. "So I stopped. I put it all away. I told myself that part of my life was over, that it died with her. But tonight," Mrs. Patterson prompted gently. The woman almost laughed, though it came out more like a sob. "Tonight, a real estate agent making a joke forced me back to the piano. And you know what? It hurt. God, it hurt. Every note felt like I was pressing on a bruise. But it also felt like breathing again after holding your breath underwater. Like maybe I've been drowning for 7 years and didn't even realize it." She stood up from the piano bench, her legs steadier now. She looked at the old broken instrument with something like affection. The silence in the community center felt different now. Before it had been the silence of anticipation, then the silence of awe. Now it was the silence of shared grief, of a room full of people suddenly connected by something deeper than neighborly pleasantries and potluck dinners. The woman stood by the piano bench, looking somehow both fragile and stronger than she had all evening, saying the words out loud. Speaking about her daughter to these near strangers had done something unexpected. Instead of breaking her further, it had released something that had been locked too tightly for too long. A younger woman, maybe in her early 30s, stepped forward from the crowd. She had a baby strapped to her chest in one of those cloth carriers, and the child was sleeping peacefully despite everything happening around them. Her eyes were red from crying. "I lost my sister 4 years ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying through the quiet room. "Car accident too. She was only 23, and I did the same thing you did. She loved photography, and after she died I couldn't look at cameras, couldn't look at pictures. I packed away all her equipment and shoved it in my parents' attic. I thought I was protecting myself." She paused, looking down at her sleeping baby. "But I was just making the hole bigger, making her absence more absolute. It wasn't until I had this little one that I realized I wanted to remember my sister, not forget her. I wanted to tell my daughter about her aunt who saw beauty in everything and captured it on film." The woman from the piano bench nodded, understanding exactly what was being said. Other people in the room shifted uncomfortably, not because they wanted to leave, but because grief is always uncomfortable when you're close to it. It reminds you of your own losses, your own fears, your own mortality. An older man, probably in his 60s, cleared his throat. "My son was a painter," he said gruffly. "Died of cancer 8 years ago. He was 31. For years I couldn't go into his old studio. My wife wanted to turn it into a guest room, but I wouldn't let her touch it. I kept everything exactly the way he left it, like some kind of shrine." He wiped at his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. But that wasn't honoring him. That was just me being afraid. Afraid that if I moved his things, I'd lose him even more. Took me 6 years to finally understand that he wasn't in that room. He was in here. He tapped his chest. And nothing could take that away. One by one, others began to share. Not everyone, and not in great detail, but enough to create a web of connection across the room. The woman who'd lost her mother to Alzheimer's. The man whose best friend had died in military service. The teenager whose grandfather had passed just last month. Each story was different, but they all circled around the same truth. Loss is universal, and so is the struggle to figure out how to keep living after it. Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening to all of this with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, finally spoke up. "We've been having these potlucks for 15 years, she said. And in all that time, we've talked about a lot of things, jobs and weather and recipes and neighborhood gossip. But we've never really talked about the things that matter most, have we? The things that hurt. The things that change us." She looked directly at the woman by the piano. "You've given us a gift tonight. Not just the music, though that was beautiful. But this honesty, this reminder that we're all carrying something, and maybe we don't have to carry it alone." The woman felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen solid for so long that she'd forgotten it was there. It was painful, yes, but it was also a relief, like blood rushing back into a limb that had fallen asleep. "Her name was Lily," she said suddenly, and then louder. "My daughter's name was Lily, and I've barely said her name out loud in 7 years because it hurt too much. But she deserves to be remembered. She deserves to be talked about. Tell us about her," Mrs. Chen said gently. "If you want to." The woman took a shaky breath. "She was funny. That's the first thing people don't know because they only think about the tragedy. But she was hilarious. She'd make up silly songs while she practiced piano, especially when she was learning a difficult piece. She said it helped her remember the finger positions. She'd sing about her cat, or what she wanted for dinner, or how her math teacher had terrible taste in ties. A few people smiled at that, and the woman felt encouraged to continue. She was kind too, really genuinely kind. She taught piano to younger kids for free because she said music shouldn't only be for people who could afford lessons. She played at nursing homes once a month, just because she liked seeing the residents light up when they heard old songs they remembered from their youth. The woman's voice grew stronger as she talked. She was stubborn. Oh my God, was she stubborn? When she decided she wanted to learn a piece that was way above her skill level, there was no talking her out of it. She'd practice for hours, days, weeks until she got it right. She had this determination that I always admired and sometimes worried about. "She sounds wonderful," the young mother with the baby said softly. She was. She really was. And the worst part about losing her wasn't just that she was gone. It was that the world kept spinning like nothing had happened. Like the most important person in my entire universe hadn't just been erased from existence. People went to work. Kids went to school. The sun came up and went down. And I was supposed to just keep going too. Several people in the room nodded. They understood that particular pain, the cruelty of the world's indifference to personal catastrophe. The piano became impossible because it was so connected to her. The woman continued. Every key I pressed, I heard her playing it better. Every piece reminded me of watching her perform, or helping her practice, or listening to her play while I made dinner. Music was our language. It was how we connected. And when she died, I lost my ability to speak it. Tom, who had been standing at the back of the crowd looking thoroughly devastated by what his joke had unleashed, finally spoke up again. "But you played tonight. You played beautifully. Does that mean you're ready to start again?" The woman considered this. Everyone waited for her answer, genuinely curious. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Tonight happened because I didn't have time to think about it, to talk myself out of it. You pushed me to the piano before my brain could throw up all its usual defenses. And now that I've played, now that I've remembered what it feels like, I'm terrified." "Terrified of what?" Mrs. Chen asked. "Of forgetting her all over again. Of moving on. People always say that like it's a good thing, moving on. But moving on feels like leaving her behind. Like saying her life and her death don't matter anymore because enough time has passed." The older man who'd lost his son stepped closer. "Can I tell you something? Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. Moving on means carrying them with you instead of being buried under them. Your daughter wouldn't want you to stop playing. If music was your language, then staying silent isn't honoring her. It's just making the world a quieter place, and I don't think that's what she'd want. The woman absorbed these words, turning them over in her mind. The baby in the carrier started to fuss a bit, and its mother bounced gently to soothe it back to sleep. Outside, the sun had fully set, and the fluorescent lights of the community center seemed harsher somehow, less forgiving. The piece I played tonight, the woman said after a long pause, was one of her favorites. She performed it at a recital when she was 15. She was so nervous beforehand that she threw up twice, but then she got on stage and played it perfectly. Not technically perfect, but perfect in the ways that matter. She put her whole heart into it. She turned back to look at the piano, running her hand along its scarred top. When I sat down tonight and my fingers found those first notes, I could feel her there. Not in a supernatural way, just in memory, in muscle memory, in the way that the people we love stay with us even when they're gone. Maybe that's enough, Mrs. Patterson said. Maybe you don't need to have all the answers tonight. Maybe you just needed to play one piece to remember that music is still there when you're ready for it. The woman nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. The teenage girl who'd approached earlier spoke up shyly. Would you ever consider teaching? I know you said you haven't played in years, but my teacher is moving away next month and I really don't want to quit. And after hearing you tonight, I can't imagine learning from anyone else. Before the woman could answer, other parents chimed in. My son needs a teacher too. My daughter has been on waiting lists for months. We'd pay whatever you think is fair. The woman held up her hands, overwhelmed. I don't know. I haven't taught in 7 years. I don't even know if I'm ready to play regularly myself, let alone teach others. Just think about it, Mrs. Chen said. No pressure. But there are clearly people here who would love to learn from you, and maybe teaching would be a way to keep that connection to your daughter alive, to pass on what she loved to a new generation. The woman felt exhausted suddenly, wrung out from the emotional roller coaster of the evening. But underneath the exhaustion was something else. Something that might have been hope, or at least the possibility of hope. The potluck dinner ended differently than any other in the 15-year history of the Friday gatherings. People lingered longer than usual, reluctant to leave the intimacy that had been created. Small groups formed, conversations continuing in hushed tones. Some exchanged phone numbers, promising to stay in touch beyond these monthly events. Others simply sat quietly, processing everything that had happened. The woman gathered her empty pie dish, preparing to slip out as quietly as she'd arrived. But Mrs. Patterson caught her at the door. Before you go, the older woman said, pressing a piece of paper into her hand. This is my number. Call me if you need anything. To talk, to cry, or just to sit in silence with someone who understands. I lost my first husband 30 years ago, and I still have days where the grief hits me like it was yesterday. You don't have to go through this alone. The woman looked at the phone number, then at Mrs. Patterson's kind, weathered face. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson replied. For reminding us all what courage looks like. The drive home was quiet. The woman lived alone in a small house about 10 minutes from the community center. It was the same house where she'd raised Lily, where her daughter had practiced piano in the living room every day after school, where they'd had breakfast together every morning and talked about everything and nothing. After Lily died, well-meaning friends had suggested she move. Too many memories, they'd said. You need a fresh start, but she couldn't leave. This house was the last place Lily had lived. Her presence was in every room, every corner, every creaky floorboard. Leaving would have felt like abandonment. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a moment, engine off, staring at her house through the windshield. The living room light was on. She always left it on, hating to come home to a dark house. It made the emptiness too obvious. Inside, she set her pie dish in the sink and stood in the kitchen, not quite sure what to do with herself. The evening had shaken something loose inside her, and she felt unmoored, adrift. Her usual routine, her careful rituals of avoidance had been disrupted. Her eyes drifted to the closed door of the living room. Behind that door was Lily's piano. Not the broken one from the community center, but a beautiful upright that they'd bought together when Lily was 12, saved up for over 2 years. The woman hadn't opened that door in 7 years. She lived in the other rooms of her house and pretended that room didn't exist. Before she could talk herself out of it, she walked to the door and turned the handle. The room smelled stale, unused. Dust covered every surface. But the piano stood there exactly as Lily had left it. Sheet music still sat on the stand, a piece Lily had been learning the week before she died. A photo in a frame sat on top of the piano, Lily at age 16 beaming at the camera with her arms spread wide like she was embracing the world. The woman approached slowly, her heart pounding. She picked up the photo, running her finger along the glass. "I played tonight," she whispered to the image. "I played your favorite piece. I wasn't as good as you, but I played it." She set the photo down carefully and sat on the piano bench. Unlike the one at the community center, this one was comfortable, familiar. She'd sat here hundreds of times, listening to Lily practice, offering guidance, marveling at her daughter's talent. She lifted the keyboard cover, revealing the keys. They were dusty but otherwise perfect. This piano had been maintained, tuned regularly up until 7 years ago. It would still sound beautiful. She pressed middle C and the note rang out clear and true in the silent house. Then another note, and another. Before long, her hands were moving across the keys, playing the same piece she'd played at the community center, but this time with no audience, no pressure, no expectations. This time it was just for her. And for Lily, she played through tears, through pain, through something that might have been healing or might just have been the first small step toward it. When she finished, she didn't feel empty the way she'd feared. She felt full. Full of memory, full of love, full of grief, yes, but also full of gratitude that she'd had 17 years with someone so extraordinary. The next Friday, the woman returned to the community center for the potluck. She almost didn't go, anxiety nearly keeping her home, but she'd promised herself she would try to stop hiding, and that meant showing up even when it was uncomfortable. People greeted her warmly, but without the overwhelming intensity of the previous week. They seemed to understand that she needed normalcy, not constant reminders of what had happened. She appreciated that more than they could know. After dinner, the teenage girl approached her again, this time with her mother in tow. "I know you said you needed time to think," the girl said, "but I wanted to ask again. Would you consider teaching me? Just me to start. Nothing formal. I could come to you, work around your schedule. I'd really love to learn from you." The woman looked at this young girl, so earnest and hopeful, and saw something of Lily in her. Not physically, but in that spark, that hunger for music that goes beyond just learning notes on a page. "What's your name?" the woman asked. "Rebecca, but everyone calls me Becca." "Becca. That's pretty." The woman glanced at Becca's mother, who smiled encouragingly. "Okay, let's try it. One lesson. We'll see how it goes, and if it doesn't work out, no hard feelings. Deal?" Becca's face lit up like sunrise. "Deal, thank you. Thank you so much." They scheduled the first lesson for the following Tuesday. When Becca arrived at the house, nervous and excited, the woman led her to the living room where Lily's piano waited. She'd spent the previous days cleaning the room, dusting every surface, organizing the sheet music, making it feel alive again instead of like a tomb. "This is beautiful," Becca said, running her hand reverently along the piano's surface. "It was my daughter's," the woman said simply. She would have wanted it to be played, not to sit silent. That first lesson was awkward, and the end.